to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and if you've never been here before, this is the Varietal Literature YouTube page. Varietal Literature is a group of writers from Vancouver who publish on our website, varietal-literature.ca, you can see down below, but also we make videos about narrative, where we just sort of had fun with narrative. What we're doing today is we are reading stories from Charles Perrault. If you don't know who Charles Perrault is, I will tell you in a minute, but I'm going to tell you something right up front. We're going to read 3 stories today. We're going to read Puss-in-Boots, which is, or also called Master Cat, which is the basis for the character from Shrek and the namesake of it. So if you're curious about that, if you look in the description and you're not watching this live, there'll be a timestamp. You can click on that, you can go straight to the story. You don't need any of the preamble or introduction of Charles Perrault if you don't want. If you're alive, you're stuck with me. We are also going to read what's called Little Thumb, which is a longer one and a darker by a good margin than anything else we're going to read one. So I'll probably read that last. So if anybody doesn't want to watch something that's quite dark, it is technically for children, but it was written by a man in the, I think, 17th century. So it's up to you if you're watching this with kids. And the other one we're going to read is called The Ridiculous Wishes, which is a short one that's just kind of silly. It's about making wishes. So if you're interested in any of those stories, they'll be timestamped in the description below. So you only have to listen to the stuff you really want to listen to. Now, who is Charles Perrault? Charles Perrault is credited as pioneering the fairy tale as a genre. I don't think that's a fair thing to say, because really what he was doing, with maybe a couple of exceptions, was he was taking folk tales and then sort of doing his own spin on them, which is a common practice. It's completely fine. But, you know, in other words, he didn't invent the world, really, that he was building on. Fairy tales are basically folk tales that got refined in a certain way. So, Charles Perrault writes in the, like I said, I believe 17th century. He predates the Grimm's brothers, or the Brothers Grimm, sorry, by like 100 years. Hello, GS. Or more than 100 years. Anyways, he is the origin of a lot of the versions of folktales that we know. So that's Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, what else? Oh, if you are a regular viewer of this channel, you would have already heard it, or you might have heard it in your life. Bluebeard is also a part of this. Holly South says your cat better make a guest appearance. Absolutely not. I have everything here on teetery tripods, and things that if you bump them an inch, they'll disconnect, because they're all, not everything here has the strongest connection. So unfortunately, it is unhappy. Smudge, my cat, is unhappy. I can hear him meowing on the other side of our soundproof door. Soundproof. And Little Red Riding Hood. Charles Perrault also is created our version of Little Red Riding Hood that we would know. And the Brothers Grimm took a lot from Charles Perrault's versions, though they also took from countryside tales and stuff and versions they found. So Charles Perrault is a pretty significant figure, if you haven't heard of him, in the fairy tale scene, as the kids call it. And we're going to read 3 stories from it. So the first one we're going to read is The Master Cat, or Puss-in-Boots, which again is the basis for the Shrek character. Then after that, we're going to read The Wishes. What was it called again? The Ridiculous Wishes, that's right. Which has an interesting guest appearance from mythology. And then the last one we're going to read is Little Thumb, which, like I said, is probably the least fitting for a younger crowd. Definitely the most grim. So that's what we're doing today. And of course, if you want, check out the timestamps below if you want to jump ahead to certain stories and you're not watching this live. So let's not faff about anymore. Wet the whistle, and we'll get into the Master Cat. This is the Master Cat, or Puss-in-Boots, from the Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. There was a miller who left no more estate to the 3 sons he had than his mill, his ass, and his cat. Pardon me. I'll mute next time. Something stuck in my throat. The partition was soon made. Neither the scrivener nor attorney were sent for. They would soon have eaten up all the poor patrimony. The eldest had the mill, the second the ass, and the youngest nothing but the cat. The poor young fellow was quite comfortless as having so poor a lot. "My brothers," said he, "may get their living handsomely enough by joining their stocks together, but for my part, when I've eaten up my cat and have me a muff of his skin, I must die with hunger." The cat, who heard all this, but made as if he did not, said to him with a grave and serious air, "Do not afflict yourself, my good master. You have only to give me a bag and get a pair of boots made for me, that I may scamper through the dirt and the brambles, and you shall see that you have not so bad a portion of me as you imagine." Though the cat's master did not build very much upon what he said, he had, however, often seen him play a great many cunning tricks to catch rats and mice, as when he used to hang by the heels or hide himself in the meal, and make as if he were dead, so that he did not altogether despair of his affording him some help in his miserable condition. When the cat had what he asked for, he booted himself very gallantly, and putting his bag about his neck, he held the strings of it in his 2 fore paws, and went into a warren where there was a great abundance of rabbits. He put bran and sow thistle in his bag, and stretching himself out at length, as if he'd been dead, he waited for some young rabbit, not yet acquainted with the deceits of the world, to come and rummage his bag for what he had put into it. Scarce was he lain down, but he had what he wanted. A rash and foolish young rabbit jumped into his bag, and Monsieur Puss, immediately drawing close the strings, took and killed him without pity. Proud of his prey, he went with it to the palace and asked to speak with his majesty. He was showed upstairs to the king's apartment, and, making a low reverence, said to him, "I have brought you, sir, a rabbit of the warren, which is my noble lord, the Marquis of Carabas," for that was the title which Puss was pleased to give his master, "has commanded me to present to your majesty from him." "Tell thy master," said the king, "that I may thank him, that he does me a great deal of pleasure." Another time he went and hid himself among some standing corn, holding still his bag open, and when a brace of partridges ran into it, he drew the strings and so caught them both. He went and made a present of these to the king, as he had done before of the rabbit which he took in the warren. The king in like manner received the partridges with great pleasure, and ordered him some money to drink. The cat continued for 2 or 3 months, thus to carry his majesty from time to time game of his master's taking. One day in particular, when he knew for certain that the king was to take the air along the river side with his daughter, the most beautiful princess in the world, he said to his master, "If you follow my advice, your fortune is made. You have nothing else to do but go and wash yourself in the river. In that part I shall show you, and leave the rest to me." The Marquis of Carabas did what the cat advised him to do, without knowing why or wherefore. Well, can I just say, maybe don't trust your cat. If they can talk, don't trust them, as a person who owns a cat. While he was washing, the king passed by, and the cat began to cry out as loud as he could. "Meow, meow, help, help, my lord, the Marquis of Carabas is drowning." At this noise, the king put his head out of his coach window, and finding it was the cat who had often brought him such good game, he commanded his guards to run immediately to the assistance of his lordship, the Marquis of Carabas. While they were drawing the poor Marquis out of the river, the cat came up to the coach and told the king that while his master was washing, there came by some rogues, who went off with his clothes, though he had cried out, "Thieves! Thieves!" several times, as loud as he could. This cunning cat had hidden them under a great stone. The king immediately commanded the officers of his wardrobe to run and fetch one of his best suits for the Lord Marquis of Carabas. The king received him with great kindness, and as the fine clothes he had given him extremely set off his good mien, for he was well made and very handsome in his person, the king's daughter took a secret inclination to him, and the Marquis of Carabas had no sooner cast 2 or 3 respectful and somewhat tender glances, but she fell in love with him to distraction. The king would need to have him come into his coach and take part of the airing. The cat, quite overjoyed to see his project begin to succeed, marched on before, and meeting with some countrymen who were mowing a meadow, he said to them, "Good people, you are mowing. If you do not tell the king that the meadow you belong to belongs to my lord Marquis of Carabas, you shall be chopped up as small as mincemeat." The king did not fail asking of the mowers to whom the meadow they were mowing belonged. "To my lord Marquis of Carabas," answered they all together, for the cat's threats had made them terribly afraid. I don't think you need to fear a cat. They're tiny. You can take them. "Truly a fine estate," said the king to the Marquis of Carabas. "You see, sir," said the Marquis, "this is a meadow which never fails to yield a plentiful harvest every year." The master cat, who still went on before, met with some reapers and said to them, "Good people, you who are reaping, if you do not tell the king that all this corn belongs to the Marquis of Carabas, you shall be chopped as small as mincemeat." The king, who passed a moment after, would needs to know whom all that corn which he then saw did belong. My God, what a sentence. I'm going to read that again. The king, who passed by a moment after, would needs know to whom all that corn which he then saw did belong. "To my lord Marquis of Carabas," replied the reapers, and the king again congratulated the Marquis. The master cat, who went always before, said the same words to all he met, and the king was astonished at the vast estates of my lord Marquis of Carabas. Monsieur Puss came at last to a stately castle, the master of which was an ogre, the richest had ever been known, for all the lands which the king had then gone over belonged to this castle. The cat, who had taken care to inform himself who this ogre was, and what he could do, asked to speak with him, saying he could not pass so near his castle without having the honor of paying his respects to him. The ogre received him as civilly as an ogre could, and made him sit down. "I have been assured," said the cat, "that you have the gift of being able to change yourself into all sorts of creatures you have a mind to. You can, for example, transform yourself into a lion or an elephant and the like." "This is true," answered the ogre very briskly, "and to convince you, you shall see me now become a lion." Isn't that another pretty picture? So many pretty pictures in these books. Puss was so sadly terrified at the sight of a lion so near him that he immediately got into the gutter, not without abundance of trouble and danger, because of his boots, which were ill-suited for walking upon the tiles. A little while after, when Puss saw that the ogre had resumed his natural form, he came down and owned he had been very much frightened. "I have been moreover informed," said the cat, "but I know not how to believe it. Then you have the power to take on the shape of the smallest animals. For example, to change yourself into a rat or a mouse. But I must own to you, I take this to be impossible."
"Impossible," cried the ogre. "You shall see that presently."
And at the same time changed into a mouse and began to run about the floor. Puss no sooner perceived this, but he fell upon him and ate him up. Sounds like a D&D group thing. Meanwhile, the king, who saw as he passed this fine castle of the ogres, had a mind to go into it. Puss, who heard the noise of his majesty's coach running over the drawbridge, ran out and said to the king, "Your majesty is welcome to the castle of my lord, Marquis of Carabas." "What? My lord Marquis?" cried the king. "And does this castle also belong to you? There can be nothing finer than this court, and all the stately buildings which surround it. Let us go into it, if you please." The Marquis gave his hand to the princess, and followed the king, who went up first. They passed into a spacious hall where they found a magnificent collation, which the ogre had prepared for his friends, who were that very day to visit him, but dared not to enter, knowing the king was there. His majesty was perfectly charmed with the good qualities of my lord Marquis of Carabas, as was his daughter, who was fallen violently in love with him. And seeing the vast estate he possessed, said to him, after having drank 5 or 6 glasses, "I will be open to yourself only, my lord Marquis, if you are not my son-in-law." The Marquis, making several low bows, accepted the honor which his majesty conferred upon him, and forthwith, that very same day, married the princess. Puss became a great lord, and never ran after mice any more, but only for his diversion. And that's Puss-in-Boots by Charles Perrault. GS says, "But Little Thumb is such an innocent-sounding title." That's what I thought. I thought it'd be like Thumbelina, which is a story that was written probably inspired by the Charles Perrault, because it's a Hans Christian Andersen story, and he's about 100 years later. But Hans Christian Andersen, is in the same genre. I'm sure he's read Charles Perrault. His story is a lot more delightful. And that's saying a lot, because Hans Christian Andersen is pretty bleak. Little Thumb is grim. The thing that I'll say about this, as I continue to build it up, the Little Thumb story, I think, is bleak because it was made in a time by people who had the problems that come up in the story and faced the choices that the story examines. Like, I think what makes it bleak is that it was a horrible time. And with that in mind, I think a lot of our sort of distaste for some of its aspects are just going to come from the fact that we don't live in such a hardship. Ollie's House says, "All cats think they're lords." Yes, they do. And GS says, "So royal." They do, in really interesting ways. Cats have this profound sense of dignity while also doing incredibly stupid things. We're not reading Little Thumb yet. What am I doing? Ridiculous Wishes. That's what we're reading. Ooh, there's a picture about the story. You get a little bit of it there. Okay. Wet my whistle, clear my throat, and we'll read the Ridiculous Wishes. Now this one has a bit of a surprising, given the era and the person who wrote it, has a bit of a surprising guest appearance. But I guess if I had to think about it, given that he's pulling from old folktales, it's probably because it was from that era, where the character that makes an appearance is from. So this is called The Ridiculous Wishes by Charles Perrault in the book, The Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault, which again you can read on Project Gutenberg if you want to. It's free. In days long past there lived a poor woodcutter who found life very hard indeed. It was his lot to toil for little guerdon, and although he was young and happily married, there were moments when he wished himself dead and below ground. I mean, same. Who doesn't? Now and then, I should say. One day, while at his work, he was lamenting his fate. Some men, he said, have only to make known their desires, and straightway these are granted, and their every wish fulfilled. But it has availed me little to wish for aught, for the gods are deaf to the prayers of such as I. As he spoke these words, there was a great noise of thunder, and Jupiter appeared before him, wielding his mighty thunderbolts. Jupiter being a Roman name for Zeus. Our poor man was stricken with fear and threw himself on the ground. My lord, he said, forget my foolish speech. Heed not my wishes, but cease thy thundering. Have no fear, answered Jupiter. I have heard thy plaint, and have come hither to show thee how greatly thou dost wrong me. Hark! I, who am sovereign lord of this world, promise to grant in full the first 3 wishes which it will please thee to utter, whatever these may be. Consider well what things can bring thee joy and prosperity, and as thy happiness is at stake, be not over hasty, but revolve the matter in thy mind. Having thus spoken, Jupiter withdrew himself and made his ascent to Olympus. As for our woodcutter, he blithely courted a reminder, in Charles Perrault era, this meant a bundle of sticks, which it kind of still does, but really not really. He blithely courted his faggot, and throwing it over his shoulder, made for his home. To one so light of heart, the load seemed so light, and his thoughts were merry as he strode along. Many a wish came into his mind, but he was resolved to seek the advice of his wife, who was a young woman of good understanding. Another very beautiful little painting here. He had soon reached his cottage, and casting down his faggot, "Behold me, Fanny," he said, "making up the fire and spread the board, and let there be no stint. We are wealthy, Fanny, wealthy for evermore. We have only to wish for whatsoever we may desire." Thereupon he told her the story of what had befallen that day. Fanny, whose mind was quick and active, immediately conceived many plans for the advancement of their fortune, but she approved her husband's resolve to act with prudence and circumspection. "'Twere a pity," she said, "to spoil our chances through impatience. We'd best to take counsel of the night. Wish no wishes until tomorrow." "This is well spoken," answered Harry. "Meanwhile fetch a bottle of our best, and we shall drink to our good fortune." Fanny brought a bottle from the store behind the faggots, and our man enjoyed his ease, leaning back in his chair with his toes to the fire and his goblet in his hand. "What fine glowing embers," he said. "What a fine toasting fire. I wish we had a black pudding at hand." Hardly had he spoken these words, when his wife beheld, to her great astonishment, a long black pudding which, issuing from the corner of the hearth, came winding and wriggling towards her. She uttered a cry of fear and then again exclaimed in dismay when she perceived that this strange occurrence was due to the wish which her husband had so rashly and foolishly spoken. Turning upon him in her anger and disappointment, she called the poor man all the abusive names she could think of. "What?" she said to him, "when you can call for a kingdom, for gold, pearls, rubies, diamonds, for princely garments and wealth untold, is this the time to set your mind upon black puddings?" "Nay," answered the man, "'twas a thoughtless speech, and with sad mistake, but I shall now be on my guard, shall do better next time." "Who knows what you will?" returned his wife. "Once a witless fool, always a witless fool." And giving free rein to her vexation and ill temper, she continued to upbraid her husband until his anger was also stirred, and when he had well nigh made a second bid and wished himself a widower. "Enough, woman!" he cried at last. "Put a check upon thy forward tongue. Whoever thought of such impertinence as this? A plague on the shrew, and on her pudding! Would to heaven it hung at the end of her nose!" No sooner had the husband given voice to these words than the wish was straightway granted, and the long coil of black pudding appeared grafted upon the angry dame's nose. And if you are unfamiliar, what they're talking about with black pudding is blood pudding. It's a sausage, coil of sausage. Our man paused when he beheld what he had wrought. Fanny was a comely young woman, and blessed with good looks, and truth to tell, this new ornament did not set off her beauty. Yet it offered one advantage, that as it hung right before her mouth, it would thus effectively curb her speech. So having now but one wish left, he had all but resolved to make good use of it without further delay, and before any mischance could befall him, to wish himself a kingdom of his own. He was about to speak the word, when he was stayed by a sudden thought. "It is true," he said to himself, "that there is none as so great as a king, but what of the queen who must share his dignity? With what grace would she sit behind me on the throne with a yard of black pudding for a nose?" In this dilemma he resolved to put the case to Fanny, and to leave her to decide whether she would rather be a queen, with this most horrible appendage marring her good looks, or remain a peasant wife, but with her shapely nose relieved of this untoward addition. There she is. I'm going to leave that up for a second. I'm going to take a drink of water. I'm going to leave it up for a second so you can observe the black pudding nose. All right. Fanny's mind was soon made up. Although she had dreamt of a crown and scepter, yet a woman's first wish is always to please. No, it's not. To this great desire, all else must yield, and Fanny would rather be a fair and drugget than be a queen with an ugly face. I don't know, what would you guys rather do? It's a tough call. Thus our woodcutter did not change his state, did not become a potentate, nor fill his purse with golden crowns. He was thankful enough to use his remaining wish to a more humble purpose, and forthwith relieved his wife of her encumbrance. Right, I forgot to mention this. So that's the end of that one. Something that Charles Perrault did, that I've seen other people do, and I don't usually read them because they're super strange, is they actually put the moral of the story in prose, in sort of structured prose, at the end. And what's odd to me is I would argue that very often it's not the moral of that story. Like, they don't seem to understand their own stories. So I'll read you this one. I'm not going to read them all because some of them are just bizarre. But here is Charles Perrault explaining to you the moral of that story. "Ah, so it is that miserable man, by nature fickle, blind, unwise, and rash, oft fails to reap a harvest from great gifts bestowed upon him by the heavenly gods." I don't know if that's really what the point is here. Holly's House says, the long black pudding thing reminds me of something exceedingly creepy from a Ghibli movie. I mean, I would imagine that Ghibli read, not Ghibli, Miyazaki read Charles Perrault. I would think so. He liked Disney a lot. And Disney, of course, does a lot of, kind of Brothers Grimm stuff. But actually, Disney does a lot of Charles Perrault. Cinderella is Charles Perrault. Sleeping Beauty is Charles Perrault. Well, okay. The versions that Disney are working with are Charles Perrault. They're all over the place. I think there's like a Sleeping Beauty in every part of Europe from a certain latitude up. All slightly different. All right. So we have left Little Thumb. So Little Thumb's a bit grim. I'll sort of say right now, because you figured this out pretty early on, it deals with, what do you do if you can't feed your kids kind of thing. It deals with a sort of strange ethical standards. I wouldn't say it's the darkest or most severe thing we have ever read here by a long shot. It's just on the more grim and down and weird side. And I always like to give a little warning for that in case you're just here for lighthearted stuff. It's not that lighthearted. GS says Ghibli has a lot of European-based stories. Yes, they do. Miyazaki does a lot of... It's interesting because I know when I was first watching all the movies, I just kind of perceived them all as being in Japan, even though, like, in some cases, it's very clearly not. It's like French flag is flying in the background or something, and I'll be like, yeah, this is an interesting part of Japan he's conceived of here. Because I'm an idiot, is actually what's happening there. But yeah, and a lot of that is informed by the fact that he was heavily inspired by Disney, and I would say significantly more talented. Okay, so, but definitely takes the format. Okay, so this is called Little Thumb by Charles Perrault from the Fairy Tales of Charles Perrault. And there's another lovely little picture. Oh, and GS said that the colors in that picture are stunning, the one colored one we saw in the last story, and I agree. There was once upon a time a man and his wife, faggot makers by trade. If you weren't here for the last story, again, faggot means bundle of sticks in Charles Perrault's time. So they gather lumber and sticks. Faggot makers by trade, who had 7 children, all boys. The eldest was but 10 years old, and the youngest only 7. One might wonder how that the faggot maker could have so many children in so little a time, but it was because his wife went nimbly about her business and never brought fewer than 2 at a birth. They were very poor, and their 7 children incommoded them greatly. Because not one of them was able to earn his bread, that which gave them yet more uneasiness was the youngest was of a very puny constitution, and scarce ever spake a word, which made them take that for stupidity, which was a sign of good sense. He was very little, and when born no bigger than one's thumb, which made him be called Little Thumb. The poor child bore the blame of whatsoever was done amiss in the house, and guilty or not was always in the wrong. He was notwithstanding more cunning and had a far greater share of wisdom than all his brothers put together, and if he spake little he heard and thought the more. There happened to come now a very bad year, and the famine was so great that these poor people resolved to rid themselves of their children. One evening, when they were all in bed and the faggot maker was sitting with his wife at the fire, he said to her, with his heart ready to burst with grief. I'm going to leave this picture up for a second. Get a little more water, because it is so pretty.
Thou seest plainly that we are not able to keep our children. I cannot see them starve to death before my face. I am resolved to lose them in the wood tomorrow, which may very easily be done. For while they are busy in tying up the faggots, we may run away and leave them without their taking any notice.
Ah, cried out his wife, and canst thou thyself have the heart to take thy children out along with thee on purpose to lose them? In vain did her husband represent to her their extreme poverty. She would not consent to it. She was indeed poor, but she was their mother. However, having considered what a grief it would be to see them perish with hunger, she at last consented and went to bed all in tears. Little Thumb heard every word that had been spoken, for observing as he lay in his bed that they were talking very busily, he got up softly and hid himself under his father's stool, that he might hear what they said without being seen. He went to bed again, but did not sleep a wink all the rest of the night, thinking on what he ought to do. He got up early in the morning and went to the riverside, where he filled his pockets full of small white pebbles, and then returned home. They all went abroad, but Little Thumb never told his brothers one syllable of what he knew. They went into a very thick forest, where they could not see one another at 10 paces distance. The faggot maker began to cut wood, and the children to gather up sticks to make faggots. Their father and mother, seeing them busy at their work, got from them by degrees, and then ran away from them all at once along a byway through the winding bushes. When the children saw they were left alone, they began to cry as loud as they could. Little Thumb let them cry on, knowing very well how to go home again, for as he had taken care to drop all along the way the little white pebbles he had in his pocket, then he said to them, "Be not afraid, brothers. Father and mother have left us here, but I will lead you home again. Only follow me." They did so, and he brought them home by the very same way they came into the forest. They dared not to go in, but sat themselves down at the door, listening to what their father and mother were saying. The very moment the faggot maker and his wife were got home, the lord of the manor sent them 10 crowns, which he'd owed them a long while, and which they never expected. This gave them new life, for the poor people were almost famished. The faggot maker sent his wife immediately to the butcher's, as it was a long while since they had eaten a bit. She bought thrice as much meat as would sup 2 people, having filled their bellies. The woman said, "Alas, where are now our poor children? They would make a good feast of what we have left here. But then it was you, William, who had a mind to lose them. I told you we should repent of it. What are they doing now in the forest? Alas, dear God, the wolves have perhaps already eaten them up. Thou art very inhuman thus to have lost thy children." The faggot maker grew at last quite out of patience, for she repeated this about 20 times, that they should repent of it, and she was in the right of it for so saying. He threatened to beat her if she did not hold her tongue. It was not that the faggot maker was not perhaps more vexed than his wife, but that she teased him, and that he was of the humor of a great many others, who love wives who speak right, but think those very importunate. Sorry, this is quite the sentence. Who are always in the right. Good Lord. I'm not trying that again. You got what you got from it. She was half drowned in tears, crying out. Can I just say, reading this silently to myself, it was no less exhausting to get through some of these sentences. I remember that sentence too. "Alas, where now are my children, my poor children?" And she spake this so very loud that the children who were at the door began to cry out all together, "Here we are! Here we are!" She ran immediately to open the door and said, hugging them, "I am glad to see you, my dear children. You are very hungry and weary, and my poor Peter, thou art horribly, horribly bemarred. Come in and let me clean thee." Now, you must know that Peter was her eldest son, whom she loved above all the rest, because he was somewhat carroty, as she herself was. They sat down to supper and ate with such good appetite as pleased both father and mother, whom they acquainted how frightened they were in the forest, speaking almost always all together. The good folks were extremely glad to see their children once at home, and this joy continued while the 10 crowns lasted. But when the money was all gone, they fell into their former uneasiness and resolved to lose them again, and that they might be the surer of doing it, to carry them at a much greater distance than before. They could not talk of this so secretly, but they were overheard by Little Thumb, who made account to go out of this difficulty as well as the former. But though he got up betimes in the morning to go and pick up some little pebbles, he was disappointed, for he found the house door double locked and was at a stand what to do. When their father had given them each a piece of bread for their breakfast, he fancied he might make use of this bread instead of the pebbles, by throwing it in little bits all along the way they should pass. So he put it up into his pocket. There father and mother brought them into the thickest and most obscure part of the forest, when stealing away into a bypath, there they left them. Little Thumb was not very uneasy at it, for he thought he could easily find the way again by means of his bread, which he'd scattered all along as he came. But he was very much surprised when he could not find so much as one crumb. The birds had come and eaten up every bit. They were now in great affliction, for the farther they went on, the more they were out of their way, and were more and more bewildered in the forest. Night now came on, and there arose a terrible high wind, which made them dreadfully afraid. They fancied they'd heard on every side of them howling wolves coming to eat them up. They scarce dared to speak or turn their heads. After this it rained very hard, which wet them to the skin. Their feet slipped at every step they took, and they fell into the mire, whence they got up in a very dirty pickle. Their hands were in a very sorry state. Little Thumb climbed up to the top of a tree to see if he could discover anything, and having turned his head about on every side, he saw, at last, a glimmering light, like that of a candle, but a long way from the forest. He came down, and when upon the ground he could see it no more, which grieved him sadly. However, having walked for some time with his brothers towards that side on which he had seen the light, he perceived it again as he came out of the wood. They came at last to the house where this candle was, not without abundance of fear, for very often they lost sight of it, which happened every time they came into a bottom. They knocked at the door, and a good woman came and opened it, and asked them what they wished. Little Thumb told her they were poor children who had been lost in the forest, and desired to lodge there for God's sake. The woman, seeing them so very pretty, began to weep, and said to them, "Alas, poor babies, whither are ye come? Do ye know that this house belongs to a cruel ogre, who eats up his little children?" "Ah, dear madame," answered Little Thumb, who trembled every joint of him as well as his brothers, "what shall we do? To be sure, the wolves of the forest will devour us tonight, if you refuse us to lie here, and so we would rather the gentleman should eat us. Perhaps he will take pity on us, especially if you beg him to." The ogre's wife, who believed she could conceal them from her husband till morning, let them come in and brought them to warm themselves at a very good fire, for there was a whole sheep upon the spit roasting for the ogre's supper. As they began to be a little warm, they heard 3 or 4 great raps at the door. This was the ogre, who was come home. Upon this she hid them under the bed and went to open the door. The ogre presently asked if supper was ready, and the wine drawn, and then he sat himself down to the table. The sheep was as yet all raw and bloody, but he liked it the better for that. He sniffed about to the right and the left, saying,
"I smell fresh meat."
"What smell you so?" said his wife. "Must be the calf which I have just now killed and flayed."
I smell fresh meat. I tell thee once more,
replied the ogre, looking crossly at his wife, and there is
something here which I do not understand.
As he spake these words, he got up from the table and went directly to the bed.
Ah,
said he,
I see how thou wouldst cheat me, thou cursed woman. I know not why I do not eat up thee too. It is well for me that thou art a tough old carrion. Here is good game, which comes very luckily to entertain 3 ogres of my acquaintance, who are to pay me a visit in a day or 2.
With that, he dragged them out from under the bed, one by one. The poor children fell upon their knees and begged his pardon. But they had to do with one of the most cruel ogres in the world, who, far from having any pity on them, had already devoured them with his eyes. He told his wife they would be delicate eating, when tossed up with good savory sauce. He then took a great knife, and coming up to these poor children, whetted upon a great whetstone which he held in his left hand. He had already taken a hold of one of them when his wife said to him, "What you need to do now? It is time enough for tomorrow."
Hold your prattling, said the ogre. They will eat the tenderer.
But you have so much meat already, replied his wife. You have no occasion. Here's your calf, 2 sheep, and half a hog.
That is true,
said the ogre.
Give them their bellyful, that they may not fall away, and put them to bed.
The good woman was overjoyed at this, and gave them a good supper, but they were so much afraid they could not eat a bit. As for the ogre, he sat down again to drink, feeling highly pleased that he had got wherewithal to treat his friends. He drank a dozen glasses more than ordinary, which got up into his head and obliged him to go to bed. He's drunk. The ogre had 7 daughters, all little children. All these young ogresses had all of them very fine complexions because they used to eat fresh meat like their father. But they all had little gray eyes, quite round, and hooked noses and wide mouth, with long, sharp teeth standing at a good distance from each other. They were not, as yet, over and above mischievous, but they promised very fair for it, for they had already bit little children that they might suck their blood. They had been put to bed early, with everyone a crown of gold upon their head. There was in the same chamber another bed of the like bigness, and it was into this bed the ogre's wife put the 7 little boys, after which she went to bed with her husband. Little Thumb, who had observed that the ogre's daughters had crowns of gold upon their head, and was afraid lest the ogre should repent his not killing them, got up about midnight, and taking his brother's bonnets and his own, went very softly and put them upon the heads of the 7 little ogresses. After having taken off their gold crowns, which he put upon his own head and his brother's, that the ogre might take them for his daughters, and his daughters for the little boys whom he wanted to kill. All this succeeded according to his desire, for the ogre, waking up about midnight, and sorry that he deferred that till morning, which he might have done overnight, threw himself hastily out of bed, and taking his great knife,
"Let us see," said he, "how our little rogues do, and not make 2 jobs of the matter."
He then went up, groping all the way, because remember, the ogre's house doesn't have electricity or anything. He's just got candles and oil lamps, and he's not lighting them for this. He came to the bed where the little boys lay, who were every soul of them fast asleep, except Little Thumb, who was terribly afraid when he found the ogre fumbling about his head, as he had done about his brothers. The ogre, feeling the golden crowns, said,
I should have made a fine piece of work of it, truly. I find I guzzled too much last night.
Then he went to the bed where the girls lay, and having found the boys' little bonnets,
Ha! said he. My merry lads, are you there? Let us work.
in saying these words, without more ado, he cut the throats of all 7 daughters. Well pleased with what he had done, he went to bed again to his wife. So soon as Little Thumb heard the ogre snore, he waked his brothers and bade them to put on their clothes presently and follow him. They stole down softly into the garden and got over the wall. They kept running almost all night, trembling all the while, without knowing which way they went. The ogre, when he waked, said to his wife,
Go upstairs and dress those young rascals who came here last night.
The ogress was very much surprised at this goodness of her husband, not dreaming what manner he intended she should dress them. But thinking that he had ordered her to go and put on their clothes, went up and was strangely astonished when she perceived her 7 daughters killed and weltering in their blood. She fainted away, for this is the first expedient almost all women find in such like cases, as if men don't too. All your children have their throats cut. Such a weird line. The ogre, fearing his wife would be too long in doing what he had ordered, went up himself to help her. He was no less amazed than his wife at this frightful spectacle.
Whoa! What have I done? Cried he. The cursed wretches shall pay for it, and that instantly.
He threw then a pitcher of water upon his wife's face, and having brought her to herself,
Give me quickly, cried he, my boots of 7 leagues, that I may go and catch them.
He went out, and having run over a vast deal of ground, both on this side and that, he came at last into the very road where the poor children were. Not above 100 paces from their father's house, they espied the ogre, who went at one step from mountain to mountain, over rivers as easily as the narrowest canals, which is canals, like rivers. Little Thumb, seeing a hollow rock near the place where they were, made his brothers hide themselves in it, and crowd into it himself, minding away what would become of the ogre. The ogre, who found himself much tired with his long and fruitless journey, for these boots of 7 leagues extremely fatigued the wearer, had a great mind to rest himself, and by chance went to sit down upon the rock where those little boys had hid themselves. As he was worn out, he fell asleep, and after reposing himself some time, he began to snore so frightfully that the poor children were no less afraid of him than when he held up his great knife and was going to cut their throats. Little Thumb was not so much frightened as his brothers, and told them that they should run away immediately towards home, while the ogre was asleep so soundly, and that they should not be anxious about him. They took his advice and got home presently. Little Thumb came up to the ogre, pulled off his boots gently, and put them upon his own legs. The boots were very long and large, but as they were actually fairies, they had the gift of becoming big and little, according to the legs of those who wore them, so that they fitted his feet and legs as well as if they had been made on purpose for him. He went immediately to the ogre's house, where he saw his wife crying bitterly for the loss of her murdered daughters. Your husband, said Little Thumb, the person who got them killed, is in very great danger, being taken by a gang of thieves who have sworn to kill him, if he does not give them all his gold and silver. Just when they held their daggers at his throat, he perceived me, and desired me to come and tell you the condition he is in, and that you should give me whatsoever he has of value, without retaining any one thing, for otherwise they will kill him without mercy. And as his case is very pressing, he desired me to make use, you see I have them on, of his boots, that I might make the more haste, and to show you that I do not impose upon you. The good woman, being sadly frightened, gave him all she had, for this ogre was a very good husband, though he used to eat up little children. Little Thumb, having thus got all the ogre's money, came home to his father's house, where he was received with an abundance of joy. There are many people who do not agree in this circumstance and pretend that Little Thumb never robbed the ogre at all, and that he only thought he might very justly and with safe conscience take off his boots of 7 leagues because he made no other use of them but to run after little children. These folks affirm that they were very well assured of this, and the more as having drank and eaten often at the faggot maker's house, that when Little Thumb had taken off the ogre's boots, he went to court, where he was informed that they were very anxious about a certain army which was 200 leagues off, and the success of a battle. He went, say they, to the king, and told him that if he desired it, he would bring him news from the army before night. The king promised him a great sum of money upon that condition. Little Thumb was as good as his word, and returned that very same night with the news. And this first expedition causing him to be known, he got whatever he pleased, for the king paid him very well for carrying his orders to the army, and abundance of ladies gave him what he would to bring them news from their lovers, and that this was his greatest gain. There were some married women, too, who sent letters by him to their husbands, but they paid him so ill that it was not worth his while, and turned to such small account that he scorned ever to reckon what he got that way. After having for some time carried on the business of a messenger, and gained thereby great wealth, he went home to his father, where it was impossible to express the joy they were all at his return. He made the whole family very well to do, bought places for his father and brothers, and by that means settled them very handsomely in the world, and in the meantime rose high in the king's favor. GS says, I thought he was saving them for his friends, and why can't he smell them under the rock? Because it's not that well written, I guess. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like the writer had a concept right up to the point where they got back to the house and the same problem hadn't been solved. And then they were like, all right, I guess he's a messenger. Because this like little addendum here is weird. Now, what I find really interesting about the story, what I do actually like, despite it being a very grim story, is how, like, morally compromised Little Thumb is. Admittedly, you know, there's a lot of survival in it, but it's pretty easy to argue that, like, there really isn't any reason for him to have gotten all the daughters killed. And he, like, adds in this line about how they were probably going to be mean anyways, but, like, you know, that's pretty questionable. He got 7 people murdered. I find that interesting. I find that interesting that Little Thumb, even within the text of the story, he questions the morality of Little Thumb, the fact that he robbed this woman who helped them, and so on, and, you know, so forth. GS says, boy, was he clever. Well, here, you want to hear the moral? At many children, parents don't repine. If they are handsome, in their judgment shine. Polite in carriage are, in body strong, graceful in mind, and elegant in tongue. But if perchance an offspring prove but weak, him they revile, laugh at, defraud, and cheat. Such is the wretched world's cursed way, and yet sometimes this urchin, whom despised we see, though unforeseen events doth honor get, through unforeseen events doth honor get, and fortune bring to all his family. Moral is, you know, even your crappy children can make you money. And on that wonderful note from Charles Perrault, thanks GS and Holly for coming and hanging out. Thanks to everybody else who came by and said hello and dropped in for a show or two. I've been Rory. This has been Fireside Fairytales. Thursday is our 1-year anniversary show of the Varietal show, which was the first thing we ever did on this channel. And it seems like if not in person, although I think at least some people are going to be in person, we should have actually a busy chat as well of people, my fellow writers from the Varietal. So you should tune in for that. It will be fun. Also, it's my actual birthday, so you should really tune in for that. And thank you so much for coming by. I'll keep the fire warm,
You guys get a good sleep and have a good night.